Welcome to SICE, to the Global Issues in Agriculture Seminar Series. We've been doing this for quite a while now. I've been hosting it for 2 years with Jonathan Haskett, who is not in the audience right now. And we have adopted this from Bob Thompson, who's sitting in the audience. He started this seminar series to try to bring more food, agriculture, and climate change to SICE and the dialogue that happens here. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Will Masters, who's from Tufts University at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. I've known Will maybe 10 years now. I think we met in 2007. When I was at Columbia University, and he was doing some work with us. He's a professor with a secondary appointment in the Department of Economics, so he's at the Friedman School in the Department of Economics. He does lots of interesting research. He really works on improving the food system, especially in developing countries. Today he's going to talk about Africa. He's done work on markets of infant foods, which he's very passionate about. Improving complementary foods, which is a big gap in low and middle income countries to improve nutrition. He's done work looking at the links between agriculture and nutrition, poverty reduction, improving rural institutions. He's done a lot of food price policy work and market participation and productivity. So it's really great to have him. He's very diverse, and what's wonderful about Will is that while he's really at Purdue, where Bob hired him, so I heard, Bob, you hired Will when he was at Purdue. While he's done a lot of ag econ, he's really been embraced by the nutrition community as well, and has done a lot of work to contribute to improving nutrition. He has a pretty incredible resume. He was at Purdue up until 2010 when he moved to Tufts. He's had a lot of different projects sponsored by USAID, DFID, the World Bank, etc. He has a great textbook called Economics of Agriculture Development, World Food Systems and Resource Use. I highly recommend you getting that if you want to delve into that. And he's also been named an International Fellow of the African Association of Ag Economists. So it's a great pleasure to have him here, and he's going to talk about nutrition transition and transformation in Africa. So you don't need that.
But I do need this. Well, thank you, Jess. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for Bob Thompson for starting this seminar. It's really a treat to be able to come to Washington and talk at a university instead of coming to USAID again and again. But this is a way of trying to visualize the big changes in agriculture and nutrition that, as Jess mentioned, I've tried to study from one perspective and then another, and other people look at from each individual perspective. And I'm asking the question in this paper, can we provide a sort of unifying visualization through which we can compare the big transitions? So the big transitions in nutrition, the big transitions in agriculture that might set Africa apart and might have really changed in the 21st century such that the path forward is different in some way than the path that was the Green Revolution, that was agricultural development in Europe, the United States, and so forth. So that's the question, and what I hope you'll do is kind of get a sense as we walk through this visualization of whether the story is compelling to you, whether it makes sense as a way to look at data, and raise your hand as soon as you see, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't quite make sense, that doesn't, okay. So stop me when this is no longer meaningful, and we'll have some time to chat at the end. So if you follow news from Africa, of course, the past 12 months or so dominated by the famines in South Sudan, Somalia, and but just in the past month, a typical news story would be this Guardian headline about stunting in Madagascar. You could have a similar story from many, many other countries where widespread stunting is associated with undernutrition. But of course, in this case, the exact following day, there's a headline about obesity epidemic and policy responses to that. So as you may know, South Africa is quite likely to introduce sugar-sweetened beverage tax to combat chronic disease associated with the transition in diets from under to over, which is simultaneously occurring within a very short distance from Madagascar to South Africa, simultaneously occurring within countries, even within households or within individuals, as there's undernutrition and overnutrition at the same time. So we're in a kind of Goldilocks problem now in global nutrition, where there's too little of some things for some people at some times, and too much of some things for some people at other times. So clearly the race against Malthus has changed in some way. Something is different today than in the past historically. So you know that at the end of the 1700s, Thomas Malthus writes his essay on population, in which he says it's clear that total population is going to outgrow the available land, and we may be able to feed people in towns with income from urban activity, but food is going to be the limiting factor. And what we know from history is that agricultural science, in some sense, for some people in some places, proved Malthus wrong. This race between population, food supply, can be traced out by relative prices. Pretty familiar chart. If you've been in classes on the history of world agriculture, you've seen something like this, which is the world prices of agricultural commodities relative to manufactured goods. And agricultural commodities on the whole throughout the 20th century just got cheaper and cheaper. Now, of course, there are periodic food price crises, but each food price crisis has been a little bit less of a peak relative to manufactured goods than the previous crisis. And so commodity prices have a sort of peak and valley form, and the long valleys have been lower. And so there's some sense that the race against Malthus has changed, and people sometimes will say, oh, we're winning the race against Malthus. We're improving productivity per acre of land faster than the number of people on that land. But that is not true everywhere. And so this is about Africa and this lag and how the race against Malthus. And it's all about changing a focus from overall agriculture to the composition of food. So this transition from agriculture to nutrition can be, I think, visualized. Sort of an initial framing of the visualization is the idea that as people move from less to more food, so this is 1,500 calories a day per person, where in very poor countries where perhaps half or so of people are children, so they're quite small. They may also be thin and short, so calorie consumption per person is quite low because people are children, thin and short. And then these lines begin in 1961, and as countries go towards higher levels of calories per day, partly because a smaller fraction of people are children, so people are taller, bigger, and may also be fatter. You may have, going from 1,500 per capita per day to over 3,000 calories per day, you have this transition not just in the quantity of food, but in the quality of food, meaning the fraction of food that comes from starchy staples. So the fraction of food that comes from starchy staples would vary. First of all, countries might get, from the very poorest, get to more food without improving. They might be among the very richest with more or less food. So the United States goes from 1961 out here and then back again in the end of in the 21st century. And then there's this period of more and different foods. So the nutrition, going from agriculture to nutrition, is going towards different foods. And the question is which foods, obesogenic or nutritious. And then when we zoom into the agriculture part of this transition, we're thinking about this escape from Malthus of people against land, where it's all about the people working the land, meaning the rural population, agricultural households that are doing some farming, some non-farming, and so forth. And this picture for the world as a whole is the UN's best estimate of the total number of people in the world from 1950 through to the present and projected out to 2050, with the total having, as you know, this exponential growth that then slows down. And the interesting thing about this picture is that the fraction of those people who are rural starts at like 75% of them back in 1950. The fraction who are urban, about 25, that grows exponentially even faster than this. So you end up with 50% rural about a decade ago. And this is that sort of amazing point in human history when the race against Malthus is changing because more than half of people are in cities. And the race against Malthus is changing for the world as a whole, where peak rural population is within sight, So by this estimate, and of course this is a very crude guess, something like 2022, where currently there's very little change in average rural area per rural person, very little change in average farm size around the world, very little change in average amount of land, soil, water, forests, natural resources per farmer. The race against Malthus is changing because we're no longer having a world where each farm is shrinking because rural population is rising. Now, the race against Malthus was hardest in South Asia in recent history. South Asia's transition looks like this. Starting in 1950, it had its rapid total population growth in the early period after South Asian independence from British rule, starting in the late 1940s, immediately after World War II. They have their population growth. They have immediate sharp break on fertility and bend the curve to flatten out like this, with those societies being overwhelmingly rural, only a very small fraction urban. And of course, these countries differ in exactly how they define urban. It's not entirely clear. There's a lot of wide error bar around this. And so what you see is in this current period, South Asia as a whole reaching its rural peak someplace out here, something like a decade from now. And South Asia, because of the different dynamic here, reaching 50% urban, not for a while. Okay, so you see these transitions occurring at different times and different speeds in different places. And of course, the point of setting it up like that is to get to Africa. And when we turn to the race against Malthus in Africa, we see the same story at a different tempo, right? The same plot with, of course, different characters, but the story arc is playing out at a very different time and speed. So what is it that we see? Africa begins 1950, still as primarily under colonial rule, although not in Ethiopia and so forth, but still primarily a continent with very little urbanization, overwhelmingly rural. African cities begin growing very rapidly here, are in the current period growing faster in proportional terms than cities anywhere in the world. So whether it's a secondary city in an African country typically or its capital city, they're growing very, very fast with constant expansion of area as well as densification of the city centers. But the total population growth only began to grow here after their independence in the 60s. And the rural population is projected to keep rising well past their 50% urban, which is not till 2040, and the rural population continuing to grow. So Africa is the only region in the world where rural population is projected to keep growing for the foreseeable future, meaning farm size is still shrinking. So Africa is the only place where the race against Malthus in the sense of rural population trying to feed itself and perhaps have a surplus to sell is harder and harder because of shrinking area of land, forest, water, natural resources per rural household. So of course it's possible to move populations to underpopulated parts of your country if you can build the infrastructure and solve whatever problem led people to not live there in the first place. Of course you can have programs that meet rural farmers whose land is shrinking with input supply, with rural services that helps them do more with less. But the fact that African farmers are the only farmers in the world who have to do more with less because land area per farm household is shrinking in Africa, whereas elsewhere it's either stable or rising, means that Africa is a place where if you're trying to sell tractors, you're not going to find a lot of consumers because farmers, not going to find a lot of buyers because farmers are having shrinking land area. But Africa is the sort of remaining part of the world where this Malthusian race is still being run in the world of rising rural population densities. So just to compare the magnitudes of this, to my mind, like the most telling kind of background to think about how the race against Malthus is changing, how is nutrition transition and agricultural transformation different in the 21st century than in the 20th century, this picture kind of tells the story in a big way. So starting just with the rural population of Southeast Asia, not a huge region, rising, stable, to the present period here. East Asia, much larger, rising, so farm sizes in China and all of East Asia shrinking as rural population rises to its peak in the late 80s and 90s, and then falling quite rapidly as East Asia urbanizes. South Asia having the same experience, South Asia peaking here as you saw before, and here's sub-Saharan Africa. So that's like the story of why it is that if one were hypothetically a student at SAIS, one might want to specialize in Africa, and you're interested in agriculture and nutrition. Why, if you are an input supply company and you're interested in the frontier of investment in agricultural inputs, you might be interested in Africa. If you're interested in rural issues generally, this is the place where, of course, it's a huge and diverse continent, but it shares a common history, shares some common features that have made it so distinctive. So when we think about nutrition, think about agriculture, how is the 20th century different from other regions? I think this background kind of has to be front and center of our consciousness as we think about visualizing the story and the differences. So how could I maybe try to communicate Africa versus other regions, change over time in a way that might make sense? So tell me if this story makes sense. So the idea is to ask whether poor countries or rich countries, whatever your level of national income is, what is your level of each nutritional or health or other variable that we're about to see? This is something called the Preston Curve, after Samuel Preston, a demographer at the University of Pennsylvania, who applied it to life expectancy in the mid-1970s. And this Bloom and Canning article from 2007 is called Ask Whether the Preston Curve is, the title of it is Still Lighting Fires. That the Preston Curve is a visualization, an approach to visualization that still ignites the imagination and makes you think about data in an interesting way. So the data we're going to look at is each country's national income, meaning their purchasing power parity level of total resources, both in the private sector and the public sector, not household income, but including all government and public services, including all foreign aid, including all of GDP per capita in income terms. We're going to look at a bunch of agricultural variables to see how they've changed, a bunch of nutritional variables to see how they've changed, and a bunch of policy responses to see how they're changed. And I believe that when you look at data in this way, a story kind of pops out at you that's quite dramatic, and the question is, does it make sense? So every data point we're going to see is a nationally representative average. So we'll see a cloud of data, and then we'll see the average for Africa and the average for the rest of the world, and we're going to be able to do a visual hypothesis test of whether those confidence intervals around those means are overlapping to see whether there's been a change from the 1990s to the 2010s. So the thing looks like this. Okay? So here's the first example, and then we're going to walk through a bunch of different examples. Okay? So raise your hand if this doesn't make sense, if the visualization doesn't sort of seem plausible. We're just looking at the national average per capita in each country for which there is data of the different types of variables that we're going to see. So this particular visualization is the structural transformations in the sense of the fraction of people who have work in agriculture. Often that's part-time work, whether a poor country or rich country. Many, if not most, farmers also do other things. But this is the International Labor Organization's estimate of that. How good is the data quality? Honestly, I don't know. I haven't investigated this in detail. Each kind of data we're about to see comes from a different source. But if you ask the United Nations system how many people work in agriculture, this is the United Nations system answer. And the green shows the average in 1991. The blue shows average in 2010. The central line is the mean at each level of income, estimated with a non-parametric regression through the cloud of data. So Local polynomial regression is estimating what is the average at each level and knitting those averages together with a bandwidth roughly like that, that is estimating what the mean is. And I'm asking the question, is the mean in 2010 different from the mean in 1991 at each level of income? And is Africa different from the rest of the world? So it's a very straightforward question answered with a Preston curve from 1975 when Samuel Preston did this originally. On the vertical axis was life expectancy. And the Preston curve with life expectancy, as you might know, goes like this, because more money does not buy life expectancy at a high level of income, but it does at a low level of income, and the curve shifts dramatically from decade to decade. Here, for agricultural transformation, is there a shift from the 1990s, early 90s to the 2010s? Not at all. The green cloud and the blue cloud are overlapping. They're indistinguishable at each level of income. The African is dramatically higher than the rest of the world. Africa is a much more agricultural continent than the rest of the world. Much more. Urbanization and rural non-farm activity, at least as far as the ILO is able to estimate, is occupying a much smaller fraction of total labor time. And there's been no shift in that structurally. The path out of agriculture goes through income growth. If you don't have income growth, there's no magic of the 21st century. What does that mean? No cell phones, no roads with better vehicles on them can get a farmer out of agricultural employment. So in other words, despite cell phones, despite all the modern technology, it doesn't get a farmer out of agricultural employment at a given level of income. And thinking about this, it's quite understandable why. You can have a cell phone as a farmer, but you don't have the other requisites, either a consumer for what you might sell as a non-farm work, or the non-farm capital that you would work with to have a non-farm job. So the path out of agricultural employment still goes through income growth, and Africa is more agricultural at each level of income. And that's entirely plausible given the fact that the level of agricultural land and pastoral land is much greater per rural person, and also this rising from year to year in the number of farmers means that it's harder for people to migrate out. So that's the style of data analysis. That's the kind of answers we get that this Preston curve approach provides when we adapt it from public health to agricultural transformation, where we're looking at both the difference between the two, Africa versus the rest of the world, and the change over time. Okay. So here's another piece of the transformation. That rural population growth rate. Has that shifted? Is it different at each level of income? Here, because the clouds are bigger, I've just split the two figures, but it's the exact same style of visualization as before, where we're asking whether from 1990 in the green to 2010 in the blue, are these distributions overlapping? Are the confidence intervals around the means overlapping? And what we see is no, these clouds are just overlaid over each other with no shifts down from the green to the blue. And Africa is distinctive in that whether it's a very poor African country like Malawi or a higher income country like Cape Verde here, although it's an outlier with, so if it's below zero, that means Cape Verde has had in 2010 the experience of shrinking rural populations. So I've had the privilege of being to Cape Verde. I don't know if, but Cape Verde is an extraordinary country fueled by remittances from where I live now in Massachusetts, with a very large number of Cape Verdeans overseas sending back tremendous remittances. And that's fueled urbanization, of course, in this shrinking. But most African countries are up here with rising rural populations and a shrinking area of land per. And the rest of the world has had lower rural population growths, although with plenty of variation. So that fact that we saw in the different way before can be framed in terms of this Preston Curve approach as well. When you have shrinking land area and relatively little modern agricultural inputs, agricultural capital, infrastructure to work with, farm institutions to help you have higher prices for what you sell and lower prices for what you buy, productivity for farmers is typically much lower in poor countries than productivity of non-farmers. So what this data visualization does is it takes the ILO data on agricultural employment, divides it by World Bank data on agricultural value added, and asks, is the agricultural value added per agricultural worker higher or lower than value added, non-agricultural value added per non-agricultural worker? And clearly the agricultural workers have much lower value added per worker than the non-agricultural. That's why after graduating from college, I started my career teaching high school in Zimbabwe, and I taught 6 classes a week of 40 or so kids, and every single one of those kids, 6 times 40, wanted nothing more than to succeed in high school so they could get a non-farm job. And then eventually, when countries get rich in the United States, the productivity gap between farmers and non-farmers, the United States is not in this particular data set, I don't think, unless it's here, is so farmers have higher or about the same productivity per worker as non-farmers. And when I taught at Purdue, many of the students in class wanted nothing more than to become farmers or to remain farmers if they had. So from poor countries with a much lower productivity per farmer to rich countries with higher or the same, what's distinctive is that Africa has had no shift up in the relative productivity gap. The two distributions are overlapping. Nothing about modern agricultural technology has closed the gap. In other words, non-farm employment has kept rising faster than farm employment, farm value added per worker. In contrast, what's happened here? Modern technology has actually brought a significantly higher blue line than green line, a significantly higher level of relative productivity for farmers than non-farmers. What is that? That's modern science that's available in the later period, the 2010, around 2010 compared to the 90s, where countries at this income level are able to use new seed varieties, new technologies that close the income gap between farmers and non-farmers in a way that Africa has not benefited from yet. Okay? So this is an example of the kind of thing we're sort of seeing in these comparisons. The headline outcome of interest for public health and nutrition is child stunting, or average child heights, but here you see the prevalence of stunting. Stunting is, of course, inhibition of linear growth, of your genetic potential for linear growth. And if children are unable to fulfill their genetic potential for linear growth, they're probably unable to fulfill their genetic potential for cognitive function, for pulmonary and cardiovascular development, for immune system development. They're going to have a constrained development path in many different dimensions. So we're just able to measure the linear growth dimension relatively well with lots of surveys around the world. So this is the combination of household surveys that's compiled by the UNICEF and the World Health Organization in their joint monitoring program for child health that gives us sort of the best collection of child height surveys in the world, where again you see the green is the early period, which is a compilation of all the 1985 to 99 observations, and the blue is the 2000s, where what you see is lots more observations than before, so we have a tighter interval around the mean, but a clear drop down from the 85 to 99 period to the 2000s, right? So at each level of income, we, the global community and these national governments and these individual households have been able to have taller children with less stunting at each level of income in a way that they were unable to get higher levels or better levels of all the things we were seeing before. But Africa's levels of child stunting at each level of income remain above other regions at their level of income. So there's a challenge that remains, and if we look at, when we say at each level of income stunting rates have gone down, this is precisely how much the glass has become more full, or the challenge remaining is still vast, but this clearly indicates that it's possible to do something with modern technology. So what is the modern technology? Well, it's mostly institutional technologies, where we have maternal and child health oriented programs in rural Africa and also rural Asia and other regions that are, for the first time, delivering both the supplementation, fortification, intervention programs, the breastfeeding behavior programs, all the whole arsenal of stunting reduction that has had a clear effect where the 21st century is better at delivering stunting reductions. You don't have to have income growth to have stunting reduction. That's stunning, right? Because nothing that we've seen up to now has had this characteristic, right? That you can get better at it through modern technology is really a remarkable story. Obesity prevalence, kind of the next thing we'd want to think about in the contrast between the two headlines, the Madagascar story of stunting and the South Africa story of the soda tax that frames this whole thing. Clearly, this is a story principally of income growth, is perfectly characteristic of the Africa income growth path, and also the rest of the world, with some shift up in the richest countries here, where you see the blue and the green confidence intervals not overlapping. There's something about modern technology that's obesogenic, but that's true when people are in the obesogenic environments that we see in the higher income countries. Some indication that it may be true to some degree, but it's not statistically significant in the sense of these confidence intervals. Some of this story has to do with diet quality. What are people eating? So Africa, no shift up in the obesity rates at each level of income, but a clear correlation with income, right? The diet quality scores are a kind of data that is extremely vexing. It's hard to think of any sort of aspect of human choices that's so fundamental and yet so poorly measured now. The data on what people are eating in the first place, the data on whether that's better or worse than some other diet, are both very poorly defined or measured questions. This is one recently published estimate that comes from a group of researchers around Tufts at the Friedman School, where they answered that question in a first pass in, admittedly, an extremely crude way. So to read the fine print in the note for this figure, right? This is diet quality of 10 healthy foods, meaning foods that are epidemiologically associated with healthful outcomes, with longevity, low cardiovascular disease risk, low rates of chronic disease. So what are those 10 healthy foods? The things you might expect. Fruits, vegetables, beans and legumes, nuts and seeds, whole grains, milk, polyunsaturated fatty acids, fish, plant omega-3s, and fiber. So a combination of some nutrients or food attributes like fiber with actual foods like fish or fruits and vegetables. And these are not weighted differently. So they're all equally weighted. And they're modeled estimates based on occasional surveys in countries that are somewhat like these countries. So this is extreme. Of all the data I'm showing you, this is like the crudest by far. An unweighted average of 10 different foods or food components that is very poorly observed in the first place and then modeled to estimate others. And what we see is that African intake of these foods is estimated to be, is modeled to be, significantly above the other regions. African people are much more rural, much lower income. They're eating a lot more of many of these things. In Africa, it doesn't really associate it with income. In the rest of the world, there is some increase in intake of these things in the middle, but no increase at higher incomes. In contrast, the unhealthy diet quality score from this same paper, which says there's 7 foods from their database that are associated with poor health outcomes. Those 7 foods are red meats, processed meats, sugar-sweetened beverages, saturated fat, trans fat, dietary cholesterol, and sodium. Those components of food or foods are less eaten in Africa, so the diet quality score is higher. Those are, generally speaking, kind of luxury foods that are clearly consumed more, so diet quality worsens as income growth grows, especially in this middle, but there's no structural change in Africa here, and there's actually even no structural change in the higher income countries. So that's diet quality. And to close out the Preston Curve analysis, it seems important to look at policy responses. So we have a story about agriculture, we have a story about nutrition, and we have a story about interventions from government, where the project that I worked on with the World Bank that was led by Kim Anderson and many, many colleagues assembled an estimate of either producer, but the data I'm going to show you now are consumer tax equivalents, meaning the price within the country compared to the price that would prevail if there were free trade. So we had consultants go to each country and attempt to find the best possible estimate of price within the country and then the actual price and then the price that would prevail if there were free trade, meaning the trading partner, the price that would be, and the margin to market that would prevail if there were free trade. And what they found across the African countries for which there's data is that on average, countries are taxing producers, subsidizing consumers, meaning prices for these foods are low. So this, what I'm showing you here is all agricultural policies, all agricultural products. This is including non-food items. And what you see for the rest of the world is tax policy that had been heavily keeping consumer prices up above the zero line of neutral trade policy, so prices above, so consumer prices about, in the estimated green line here, on average 0.5. Of course, the sample of countries at this very high level is not representative of the average person in the world, but at this level of income. But that went sharply down after the Uruguay Round Trade Agreement of 1995 brought a certain measure of commitment to freer trade in these richer countries. So richer countries had their average food prices fall sharply towards the level of food prices, the same food prices in the world, while African countries had no comparable big shift in relative food prices. The next big intervention is what governments are doing with their tax revenue. Are governments providing the public goods in the health sector, in the agricultural sector? We don't have specific evidence on expenditures for nutrition. So Jess Franzo and colleagues are working on a lot of interesting analysis of government programming and trying to focus attention and also get better data on what government's doing specifically for nutrition. But if we think of nutrition as somehow the intersection between health expenditure and ag expenditure for which there is relatively good data, here's what the IFPRI speed data set, the statistics on public expenditures and economic development that IFPRI has assembled for health and for agriculture looks like this. The bottom row is agriculture, with Africa in the first column, rest of the world in the other. What you see is that agriculture in the bottom row, that tends to fall. Public expenditure on agriculture as a share of all GDP tends to fall as income rises. Doesn't fall that much as income rises in the richer countries. But health spending doesn't. Health spending stays constant or rises as a share of GDP as countries get richer. And Africa has not had a significant shift up in agriculture or in health spending per capita at each level of income. So out of all of this kind of clouds of data with the estimated mean for each level of income shifting or not shifting, I hope you get a kind of approach to visualization that, without imposing too much theory on this, allows us to visualize the data. If you're looking at this from the point of view of policymaker, in Washington, think about US government's Feed the Future strategy. The US government is just reformulating Feed the Future and has specified a new set of target countries on which they want to focus their attention. You realize that each country has a unique story, okay? So clearly there's lots of diversity within the countries. These are a few examples highlighted here. Countries, no one is the mean country, right? Everyone understands that, and yet means are still important information. But you'd also then want to investigate how that country differs from the norm for Africa, and how that within that country there may be lots of heterogeneity by region, by ethnic group, by age, or other kinds of strata within each country. But I would hope that this way of visualizing is something that makes sense, is useful, helps us to understand how things are to some degree the same and to some degree different over time. So what are the big takeaways for me, at least, having looked at these, squinting and trying to see how would I tell the story of this? Overwhelmingly, there is a stable development path. Like, people need a level of capital accumulation, of resources around them, in order to be able to afford to buy and to do certain kinds of things. Just because you have a cell phone in your hand does not mean you can have higher productivity on the farm, higher living standards, and so forth. It may matter in many ways, but the observable evidence, as far as we have, it says most countries are along their stable development path, but there are some variables that shift at a given income level. So the central path that different regions are on is dominated by the fact that Africa still has this Malthusian threat of shrinking land area from rising rural population. That's not because African cities are not growing fast enough. Remember, African cities are growing faster than cities anywhere else in the world. Can't ask African cities to grow faster than Asian cities, right? They're already growing as fast as they're bursting at the seams, right? So, and individual people are moving to town as fast as they possibly can. So saying that people should urbanize faster is just not very helpful, right? People are already moving as fast as they possibly can to the city. But the number of people left behind in the rural areas will continue to rise for the foreseeable future, inevitably, for the continent on average as a whole. Of course, there may be lots of differences from place to place, but if you think about the continent and its shared history, geologically, the geological history of what's the land, what are the rivers, what are the resources that are somewhat similar across Africa and different from the rest of the world, and what is the shared history of colonization that only was lifted in independence in 1960s. So as a result of that, the development path of Africa is that it continues to have this larger share of its workers in agriculture than elsewhere. It continues to, and this lower productivity relative to non-ag workers. It continues to have this higher rates of stunting at each level of income. But stunting is one thing that has been amenable to technological change or institutional change as we've responded to it with resources for maternal and child nutrition. And this unique demography or demographic stage of demographic transition that Africa is in will continue to be an ongoing challenge, right? An ongoing headwind, if you will, where from year to year, this shrinking land area per farm household means you have to do more with less, whereas farmers elsewhere can have a constant or even rising rural area per household. So that's the basic story that frames at least my thinking, and I hope it's a useful perspective for you. Here's the credits for it. I hope referees like this story. We did get one round of reviews back that were fairly positive, so I have no idea if this is the kind of visualization that's resonant and can be successful, but I hope it's been something that's useful for you.
There's microphones in the back. I'm not sure if those are working, but maybe we can move those up a bit. So, and the reason why we asked for the microphones is just because it's being recorded, so people can hear on the feed. So if you wanna move those, don't trip on the way out. And then come up and ask questions. Please identify yourself, who you are, where you're from. Oh, Haley can do it if I can hear it out. Any questions?
Is it this one? Okay.
We'll allow for Bob to start the first question, and then in the back.
Yeah, I enjoyed that. Will, can you flip back to the last summary slide there? Yeah. That force even more of them into poverty, your third line from the bottom, struck me as, aren't they already being born into severe poverty by and large? That we say 70% of the extreme poverty is in rural areas, and most of them are farmers, and that when you consider the value added per person in those rural areas, aren't the majority of these rural kids being born into poverty? So it's just forcing them deeper into poverty?
Yes, although one could imagine households who are in a village, just above a poverty line, whatever poverty line you might choose, where that village, given its particular place in its country, was able to keep, a given fraction of its people on. If it goes to 2% and then 2% and then 2% again, higher population.
Yes, it seems to me that one of the policy implications is that there's a strong call for rural economic development, non-farm development of small cities and market towns, so that more job opportunities are created within commuting distance of farms. As every other country and every other region of the world, the majority of the rural poor have escaped poverty by commuting out of agriculture at 8 in the morning and back at night, or that it's using part-time non-farm employment. And that's true today in the United States and Europe and Japan, and it seems in every other developing region. So it just seems that that's a story that needs to be. We need technology to raise productivity in agriculture to maximize earning potential, but we still got to create economic activity for a lot of those kids that are born into this poverty. Yeah. My only other comment is that my only fear with this data is that what the media will pick up on is the story that has the weakest empirical foundation, the quality of food, two slides on quality of food, because that'll be the easier story. It's a story that a lot of media would like to tell, and I really worry that they make the most out of that, and I'm very nervous about those data.
Yeah, good points. Very good points.
Andrew Muhammad, Economic Research Service. I enjoyed it, Will. Just a real quick question. What's the quality of, I guess, the economic development in cities in terms of labor demand versus just excess labor supply? To what degree, is there a greater likelihood for success in cities than in years past? Because I can imagine if quite a few cities in this country was like Detroit, particularly like Detroit of 3 or 4 years ago, you would see a growing rural population because the cities won't necessarily yield the return you would expect, and then there's a certain risk to move into the city. And you think about how Uganda has like a high degree of entrepreneurs, but they're like necessity entrepreneurs. So we're not talking about rich people, but individuals who are forced to do these sort of create their own personal jobs because the cities just can't accommodate them. And so I'm wondering, to what degree the sort of the economic of cities and the risk associated moving to cities has sort of affected this dynamic, and the reason why we don't see it, say, in other parts of the world.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been very puzzled. I've done a few papers on urbanization. I'm not really an urban economist, but I've done a few papers on that. I think there's a few facts about cities in Africa that really, jump out at me. The first is the point I've already made, that the number of people in towns and cities in Africa is growing year to year faster. Africans are voting with their feet to choose city life over rural life overwhelmingly as much as possible. And that includes small towns, right? So people are moving to those. Despite that it's entrepreneurship of necessity, it's a better life. But African cities are very different from cities elsewhere in another way, which I haven't mentioned yet, which is that African cities have much better public health than cities in history elsewhere, and even today elsewhere. So African cities, because they have lower infant mortality, have had higher fertility. People have chosen to have their children in cities. And when I started working in Africa, in Zimbabwe, teaching high school, and then working in the Ministry of Agriculture in Zimbabwe in the 1980s, or then working around West Africa in the 1990s, you would talk to people where did they grow up? They grew up in the rural areas, but now they're working in town. Now I go to ministries in Africa, go to food companies in Africa. People grew up in town. And this is clear from demographic data that people are choosing to have their children in town and raise their children, and mortality rates are low enough in town that most urban jobs are taken by people who grew up in town. So Africa's very rapid urbanization rates is being fueled by natural increase within urban areas, natural meaning the fertility and age structure that gives rise to each cohort of young job seekers. And that is one other headwind against rural Africans seeking employment in town. Okay, so there's multiple interacting headwinds, of which that's a very important one. But clearly living standards are better. There are inhibitions on migration that prevent equalization of value added per worker or living standards, right? Diet quality is better, health outcomes are better. Despite the obvious kind of difficulty of living in town, it's better than the less visible but clearly worse outcomes in the rural area.
There are a couple questions over here. Why don't we take the two questions and then Willie, you can answer both. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Friedman. I'm at the World Bank, working for the Africa Agriculture Policy Unit. So we're dealing a lot with agriculture transitions and nutrient transitions and so on. So having dealt with this issue for a little while, I think I would have a few comments on your conclusion in terms of agriculture productivity. Because I think the way you define productivity, at least in your work, was largely looking at land productivity, right? So you wouldn't really look at labor productivity.
No, this was just the ILO average.
Okay, so I
labor,
think,
yeah.
for instance, De Janvry from IFPRI, he showed that when you look at labor productivity, what we find is when you look at the annual labor productivity,
Yes.
Productivity in Africa is much lower, or in agriculture as opposed to non-agriculture. But when we look at labor productivity per month, so basically we find that we
Yes.
have high seasonality in labor productivity.
Yes.
Because, and I think I agree, or this goes together with what you have said, we basically have to smoothen out the labor calendar, because a lot of
Exactly.
people cannot work off-farm because there's simply no off-farm employment, right? So when we then look, okay, what does it mean in terms of off-farm employment, this kind of changes the productivity story a little bit. Also, there's a new paper of Mario Herrero and colleagues who showed that basically the larger the land, so when you look at land sizes, the more staples are produced, basically the less nutrient-rich foods are produced, which also goes together with what you're finding. So, but then kind of concluding that we just need to look at an increase in agriculture productivity, which is largely related to land productivity. I just would draw from just reading this a little cautious conclusion, or I would be a little cautious from reading that basically agriculture productivity should also look at then, these labor productivity implications, and also the implications when you increase the productivity of land in terms of staples. which would then reduce the nutrient-rich
Right.
food of people. So I think there's more behind this, looking at pure
Yes. Yeah.
economic or macroeconomic data like this. So I think this is the point I want to make. And the third point, David Shirley, I don't know, in his work, he looks a lot at dietary shifts in Africa.
Yes,
So
yes.
basically, this also goes with what you were saying. He looks a lot at the relevance of secondary and tertiary towns.
Yes.
And also the kind of dietary shifts towards more less perishable foods, towards less nutrient-rich foods, towards more convenient foods. And you also
Yes.
mentioned it in South Africa, that people are getting more and more obese because they are eating less and less healthy food. So
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know if there's a real kind of conclusion to that, but I think we just need to factor in these kind of trends as well,
Yeah.
and this kind of also productivity or differences in productivity in order to then make policy conclusions.
Yes. A lot of
Thank
good
you.
points there.
Hi, Gawain Kripke with Oxfam. Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed it. It was very thought-provoking. Just a couple thoughts, maybe in question. Questions. One is on looking at these means, GDP, purchasing power per capita. I'm getting it wrong, but
Yeah.
and I mean, one of the things that we observe is that means are very misleading without thinking about inequality within them. And not that I have a proposition to make, but I think it might be useful or interesting to try to see about Gini coefficients or some other measure of inequality at the same time as you're looking at the purchasing means, because there may be something interesting in that as well about how unequal countries are in their income or wealth or something like that. So just that was an observation as you're looking at that. The other thing is you looked at the so the policy cost of food, the trade and other, but I wonder if you did, or if it's possible to look at. I'm interested in sort of the integration, a measure of integration. The policy intervention and its effect on price is one sort of proxy for that, but the actual trade flows or the amount of
Right.
the amount of food imported or exported possibly, and the transmission of price and so forth is interesting to me in terms of how integrated food economies are into the sort of global food economy. And I think that might be another interesting sort of prism to look at it, like how integrated into the global food system a country is, and whether those have implications on some of these. And two things I sort of take, I'd like to test with you. One is, I can't quite tell if you're trying to argue that Africa's different or Africa's not different. You sort of said both during your presentation. And are you coming down one way or the other or not? Like, is the model going to work? Is the model going to work in Africa in the past as it has in the past or not? You can make an argument that the world is different. There's China now, and like industrial development just isn't going to do the same thing for Africa that it did. Or are you trying to argue the opposite? I'm not clear. And for me, the story was that really cool table that showed the rise in obesity over time across income, and that there's some new technology that's making people fat in that time period. I mean, that is like total headline story right there to me. Bob's comment that he's worried about the wrong message, but that was that's different data, and that's a pretty...
On the inequality. The inequality, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, that's a lot, but anyway.
So those were both very, very rich, diverse, lots of things going on. Let me just go sort of in reverse order. So the rise in obesity at each income level struck you more than the decline in stunting at low income levels.
No, not more, but no. That's very important, and I like it, and that's an important technological breakthrough. I agree with that. Yeah.
Because we have a very well-known psychological bias, a heuristic in human affairs towards bad news, right? We have real bad news bias, right? You're interested in bad news for good reasons, right? If you're a villager in evolutionary time, the villagers who pay more attention to bad news are going to survive rather better than those who pay attention to good news. So a bad news bias is baked into us very, very deeply. but it does limit our ability to respond to opportunity. When we see the opportunity, something like the ability to reduce stunting, and we don't invest, even more than we have been to keep that decline going. And I think we are making very concerted efforts around the world towards reduced stunting, but clearly this is something we have been able to achieve. For any given level of income, lower stunting is pretty amazing. And the higher obesity, yes, that is quite striking. The change in inequality and differences in inequality are a whole fascinating area of work that I'm starting to dive into a little bit, as is the degree of integration and volumes of trade and the other point you mentioned. The several points that you made about labor productivity and response within agriculture are very apt. In addition to the papers you mentioned, there's a wonderful paper at the hour level using the LSMS time use data, which admittedly are, but as best that paper found, so this was Chris Barrett with McCullough, yeah. I'm forgetting her name though, her first name, Ellen? Sorry. She found that on an hourly basis, earnings are the same. And that's quite understandable, right? People are able to equalize. So what's missing in African agriculture is the opportunity to work, right? That's the thing. And that's what we understand by labor-intensive agricultural intensification, right? That's what it consists of, is giving people opportunities to do a little more soil and water conservation, a little more planting intensity, more closely planted plants because you can have water and fertilizer to meet their needs. A little more harvesting time, weed control time, post-harvest time. It's the opportunity to use agricultural land and water and so forth to employ yourself. And of course, the non-farm employment is crucial as well, but without something on the land that you own to sell, it's very hard to buy something from non-farm activity.
Thank you, Will. As always, you are very stimulating. And but I wanted to ask if, can you, pardon me? Please tell everyone who you are. Oh, sorry. My name is Uma Lele, and I am a retiree from the World Bank from a long time ago. I have a number of questions to ask you. One is, you said that the consumption patterns in rural areas in Africa are better than they are elsewhere. They're consuming more of fruit, vegetables, et cetera, right? Than in,
at each
say,
level of income.
in South Asia, right?
At each level of income. Yes.
At each level of income.
By that metric.
Right. So I think one of my questions was, if that is the case, why is it that there is more stunting in Africa than there is? I mean, there is huge amount of stunting in India, for instance, right? And there you know that the diets are quite poor because poor people just can't afford to eat more fruits and vegetables. So if you are saying that that is the case in Africa, then one question, that's one question. The second thing is you talked a lot about income inequality, right? Mm-hmm. Rural, urban, et cetera, et cetera. And once upon a time, when I used to work for the World Bank, people used to say income inequality is not as bad as not raising incomes of the poor, okay? Inequality is not bad as long as you are getting more people out of poverty. Mm-hmm. And and I've been looking at lots of numbers on many countries on structural transformation, including in India recently. And what you find is that income inequality has increased a lot in East Asia, much more than in South Asia. And whenever I read papers written by Indians, for instance, or South Asians, they're always concerned about income inequality. And I'm saying to them, don't be so concerned about income inequality, but be more concerned about the incomes of the poorest people. And that is where I think countries like Vietnam and China, Indonesia, are way ahead of India because the incomes of the poorest people have increased more there than they have in India, although income inequality in China is through the roof, as you know. So that was another question, another point I wanted to make about your presentation. And you may be a little more optimistic about South Asia than I am after looking at the numbers. I think one of the big problems for South Asia, including India, for instance, is being able to create more non-farm employment which is productive. And just look at the share of manufacturing in GDP in India. It's stuck at 11%, if I remember correctly. And despite all the rapid growth and the government doing, I think to their credit, a lot of good things to create employment, not much is happening. And it has many reasons why it's not happening. So I know that Africa's transition is delayed compared to, say, South Asia. And South Asia is behind East Asia, etc. But I don't know whether it is any different in that sense. My sense is that a lot of the growth in Asia has come from irrigation, which you never mentioned, right? And if I look at poverty in India, for instance, there's big push now for doubling farmers' income, so been looking at numbers on that. It's very closely related to rain-fed agriculture compared to irrigated agriculture. Because when there is irrigation, you have double and triple cropping, and that explains why you have much more employment in the agricultural sector. But when it's rain-fed, there aren't many choices in the off-season, etc. So I think there is probably more to your story than you could tell us in a short period of time.
I hope there's more to the story.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this clearly is just a very quick cut. In terms of the points you made, there's just take a few in reverse order from the end. Starting with the role of manufacturing. So there's a number of dramatic papers on Africa and, as you say, some parts of Asia having much lower levels of manufacturing at their level of income and for their income growth. And I think one way that the 21st century definitely differs from the 20th is that manufacturing is less important. It's that traded goods generally are cheap enough, and that the structural transformation out of agriculture is much more into services than it had to be in the 19th and 20th century when you had to manufacture stuff. And I don't think African countries have to manufacture stuff. I think manufacturing stuff is pretty darn cheap, actually. So it's much more important to have employment and productivity in the services sector, which is a much larger share of all workers and so forth, and it's low productivity in services, right? That's a much bigger problem than low productivity in manufacturing, because other people can, because manufacturing goods, you can put in a boat. You can put them on a train, as long as you got something to sell and exchange. And often for African countries, that's remittances, meaning labor, right, export of labor. Also about income inequality and the level of the poor, I think that's hugely important. Often the first model, the first way that somebody describes something is pretty accurate. So for development, the Luas Model, the two-sector model that Luas first wrote down in 1950-something, said that in rural areas, you've got this floor of living standards, and then you've got a gradient up to higher income, so people can go to town and get richer, and you'll have high rises in the city with very rich people who have the same living standard as they do in Europe or the United States. He was writing about the Caribbean, but this would be true generally. And so that floor of living standards in the countryside is set by smallholder agricultural productivity, what they can do with the land they have, and the non-farm employment, the rural non-farm employment that they have access to from their farmstead. So doing what you can to that rural living standard that's literally horizontal in space because people have had to move out to the periphery, right? So that's really crucial. And then, as you say, inequality can be good. There's a good component to inequality, which is the ladder up that people can climb as long as there's social mobility in that Luas model that is illustrated like this, right? So you also mentioned the first point you made. Yes. So lots and lots of specific dimensions of what would raise agricultural productivity per worker, including the point that per hour it may be the same. It's just that opportunities for employment, irrigation is a huge part of it. One of the geological or geographic differences between Africa and the rest of the world, as you undoubtedly know, is, or I hope you know, is many fewer river systems, right? So people are much farther from bodies of water, irrigable surface water. And the surface is partly related to that, is much more aged. So African soils are much more geologically exposed for longer in geological time, with less sediment, sediment deposition. So.
If anyone's interested in being on the mailing list for the seminar series, if you're not, please email me. My name is Jessica Fonzo. You can find me Google Hopkins Professor jfonzo1@jhu.edu. So feel free to email me. And thank you so much, Will.
Thank you. Thank you.
Will will hang out for a little bit. People want to ask questions.
Seiner Webseite